I stand in this packed courthouse today, 32 years old, watching my biological parents smirk confidently at their legal team. They're suing me for $6.5 million left by my adoptive father, Walter, the man who found me abandoned at baggage claim when I was 5. My birth parents claim parental rights override adoption papers. Their lawyer whispers something that makes them chuckle. The bailiff calls for all to rise. My heart pounds as I realize the judge walking in looks familiar, but I cannot place where I've seen that face before. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. December 15th, 1991. I was 5 years old, sitting alone on the cold terrazzo floor of Denver International Airport's baggage claim area, clutching my torn teddy bear named Captain. The carousel had stopped spinning hours ago, and most of the travelers had disappeared into the snowy Colorado night. My parents, Daniel and Susan Parker, had told me to stay put while they grabbed coffee from the concourse upstairs. "Don't move from this spot, Milton. My mother had said, her voice sharp with irritation. "We'll be right back." That was at 3 in the afternoon. The terminal clock now showed nearly midnight. Airport announcements echoed through the cavernous space every few minutes, but none mentioned my name. My stomach growled painfully. I'd finished the half-eaten granola bar from my pocket hours earlier. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and every footstep made me look up, hopefully thinking my parents had finally returned. A security guard named Officer Martinez found me curled up beneath a row of plastic chairs, shivering despite my winter coat. "Hey there, buddy," he said, gently crouching down to my level. "What's your name? Where are your mom and dad?" I told him everything through hiccuping sobs. How we'd flown in from Phoenix. How my parents had been whispering angrily during the flight about bills and lawyers. How they'd seemed nervous and distracted all day. Officer Martinez radioed for backup and child services, but what happened next changed my life forever. Walter Brennan was emptying trash bins in the baggage claim area when he noticed the commotion. He was a night shift janitor, a quiet man in his mid-40s with kind brown eyes and hands calloused from honest work. While Officer Martinez filled out paperwork and waited for social services, Walter sat beside me on one of those uncomfortable airport benches. "You know," he said in a voice as warm as hot chocolate. "I used to work on airplanes before I cleaned them. Want to hear about the biggest jet I ever fixed?" For the next 2 hours, Walter told me stories about jumbo jets and cargo planes, about pilots who flew through thunderstorms and mechanics who could hear problems in an engine just by listening. His voice was steady and calm, nothing like my father's sharp tone or my mother's constant sighing. When I shivered, he draped his work jacket around my shoulders. It smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies, but it felt safer than anything I'd known in my short life. When Janet Rodriguez from Child Protective Services finally arrived at 2:30 in the morning, she found me fast asleep with my head on Walter's shoulder. He'd stayed 3 hours past the end of his shift, gently stroking my hair and humming old folk songs his grandmother had taught him. "Sir, you really didn't need to stay," Janet said, gathering the paperwork that would send me into the foster care system. "We'll take good care of him from here." Walter looked down at my sleeping face, then back at Janet. "Ma'am, I know this might sound strange, but could I visit him? Wherever he ends up, I just want to make sure he's okay." Something in Walter's voice made Janet pause. She'd seen hundreds of abandoned children in her 15-year career, but rarely had she witnessed such genuine concern from a stranger. "I suppose that could be arranged," she said carefully. "You'd need to pass background checks, of course." The next morning, Walter appeared at the temporary foster home with a bag full of picture books and a registration form for prospective adoptive parents. Janet stared at the paperwork in disbelief. "Mr. Brennan, adoption is a lengthy process," she explained. "It can take years, especially for a single man with no previous experience raising children." Walter's smile was patient and determined. "I've been thinking about adopting for months," he said quietly. I've been taking parenting classes at the community center, reading everything I could find about child psychology. I just never imagined I'd find the right child this way. The twist that no one saw coming was Walter's level of preparation. His apartment had already been child-proofed. His spare bedroom contained a twin bed with superhero sheets, a desk for homework, and shelves lined with educational toys. His kitchen cabinets were stocked with nutritious snacks and children's vitamins. It was as if he'd somehow known he was going to find a child who desperately needed him. When Janet asked about his motivation, Walter's eyes grew distant. "I grew up in foster care myself," he admitted. "Aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a duffel bag. I swore that if I ever had the chance to give a child what I never had, I'd take it." The paperwork moved through the system with unusual speed. Walter passed every background check, psychological evaluation, and home inspection with flying colors. His references from work described him as reliable, gentle, and endlessly patient. His landlord praised his responsibility and kindness toward neighbors. 3 months later, I was officially Milton Brennan, and Walter was my father in every way that mattered. As we drove away from the courthouse after the adoption hearing, I asked him the question that had been bothering me since we first met. "Walter, why did my real parents leave me at the airport?" He pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face me, his expression serious but loving. "Milton, I don't know why some people make the choices they do, but I want you to understand something important. What happened to you wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes adults have problems they don't know how to handle, and they make terrible decisions that hurt innocent children." He reached over and squeezed my small hand in his much larger one. "But I promise you this, son, you will never be abandoned again. You are my family now, and family means forever." Looking back now, standing in this courtroom 32 years later, I realized that moment was when my real life began. Not when I was born to Daniel and Susan Parker, but when Walter Brennan chose to love a broken little boy he'd found crying in an airport at midnight. 10 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. By the time I turned 15, life with Walter had settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Our modest 2-bedroom apartment on Maple Street became my sanctuary, every corner filled with evidence of Walter's patient love and quiet wisdom. Walter worked 3 jobs to support us, but he never complained or made me feel like a burden. Monday through Friday, he cleaned offices downtown from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Weekends found him on construction sites, his hands growing even more calloused as he framed houses and poured concrete foundations. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, he tutored struggling students in mathematics at the local community center, charging half the rate of other tutors because he believed everyone deserved a chance at education. Despite his exhausting schedule, Walter always made time for me. Every morning, I'd wake to find him at our small kitchen table, already dressed in his day clothes with breakfast prepared, and my school lunch packed in a brown bag decorated with encouraging notes. "Today's math test will be a breeze for you, kiddo." Or, "Remember, being kind costs nothing but means everything." Our apartment was small but felt enormous compared to the cramped foster homes I dimly remembered. Walter had built most of our furniture himself in the building's basement workshop. The kitchen table where I did homework was crafted from reclaimed oak, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with everything from classic literature to science textbooks to repair manuals for various types of machinery. Walter's love of learning was infectious. He'd quiz me on vocabulary words while I helped him prepare dinner, turning education into a game rather than a chore. When I struggled with algebra, he'd create real-world problems involving construction measurements and carpet installation costs. History came alive through his stories about the neighborhoods he'd watched change during his years of night shifts. "Education is the one thing no one can ever take away from you," he'd say while reviewing my report cards. Money can disappear, jobs can end, but what you learn becomes part of who you are forever. Our neighbors on Maple Street adored Walter. Mrs. Chen from apartment 3B brought us homemade soup when either of us caught a cold. Mr. Rodriguez from downstairs borrowed Walter's tools for household repairs and always returned them cleaner than he'd found them. The building's elderly residents knew they could count on Walter to shovel their walkways in winter or carry heavy groceries up the stairs. What puzzled me, even as a teenager, was how Walter seemed to know things that janitors and construction workers typically didn't. When I brought home assignments about the stock market, he could explain complex financial concepts with ease. He understood legal terminology, architectural principles, and business strategies in ways that seemed unusual for someone with his background. Once a month, a man named Thomas Chen visited our apartment. He arrived in expensive suits and drove luxury cars that looked out of place in our working-class neighborhood. Walter introduced him as an old friend, but their conversations often moved to the kitchen, where I couldn't overhear. Thomas always brought me gifts, scientific calculators, college preparatory books, and brochures from prestigious universities I'd never heard of. "Your father is a remarkable man," Thomas would tell me after these visits. "He's teaching you values that will serve you well in life." When I asked Walter about Thomas's profession or how they'd met, Walter's answers were always vague. "We worked together years ago," he'd say with a dismissive wave. "He's just someone who believes in investing in young people's futures." High school flew by in a blur of academic achievements that amazed my teachers. I excelled in mathematics and business studies subjects that Walter encouraged enthusiastically. My guidance counselor, Ms. Patterson, called me into her office during senior year with news that changed everything. "Milton, your SAT scores are exceptional," she announced, spreading college brochures across her desk. "You qualify for full scholarships to several top-tier universities. Stanford University has specifically expressed interest in your application." Stanford. I'd seen their brochure among Thomas Chen's gifts, but never imagined I could actually attend. The tuition costs alone were more than Walter earned in 2 years of his 3 jobs combined. That evening, I showed Walter the acceptance letter that arrived just 2 weeks after I'd submitted my application. The timeline seemed impossibly fast, but Walter's smile was radiant with pride. "Stanford, son, that's one of the finest schools in the country. You're going to do incredible things there." "But Walter, I can't accept this," I protested. "Even with the scholarship, there are living expenses, books, travel costs. You've already sacrificed so much for me." Walter's expression grew stern, the same look he'd worn when teaching me about integrity and hard work. "Milton, you listen to me carefully. This opportunity is exactly what we've been working toward all these years. Everything I've done every late night and early morning has been to give you chances I never had. You're going to Stanford, and we'll figure out the finances." Somehow we did figure it out. Anonymous donations appeared to cover my dormitory costs. Textbook vouchers arrived in the mail with no return address. When I needed a laptop for classes, Walter presented me with a top-of-the-line computer that he claimed he'd gotten a great deal on from a friend. The night before I left for California, Walter and I sat on our apartment's tiny balcony, looking out over the city lights. I was 18 years old and terrified of leaving the only real home I'd ever known. "Walter, what if I fail? What if I can't handle the academics or fit in with kids who grew up wealthy?" He turned to face me, his weathered hands gripping the balcony railing. "Milton, let me tell you something I've learned in 43 years on this earth. Success isn't about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to work and how true you stay to your values. You've got more integrity and determination than most adults I know. Stanford is lucky to have you." As I packed my belongings the next morning, I noticed Walter moving carefully around the apartment, touching familiar objects as if memorizing them. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed old and fragile. The years of physical labor and long hours had etched lines around his eyes and silver threads through his dark hair. I'm going to miss you." I admitted struggling not to cry in front of the man who'd saved my life. Walter pulled me into a bear hug that smelled like sawdust and coffee, the same comforting sense I'd known since childhood. "I'm going to miss you too, son. But this isn't goodbye. This is just the beginning of the rest of your life. Call me every week right when you can. And remember that no matter how far you go or how successful you become, you'll always have a home here with me." Walking away from that apartment felt like tearing out a piece of my heart, but I carried Walter's love and lessons with me like armor against whatever challenges lay ahead. I had no idea that our time together was already running shorter than either of us imagined. Stanford University overwhelmed me in the best possible way. The campus sprawled across 8,000 acres of manicured lawns and sandstone buildings that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. My dormitory room was larger than my childhood bedroom, and my roommate Jake Martinez came from a family that owned 3 restaurants in San Diego. The academic workload was intense but manageable thanks to Walter's years of drilling study habits into my routine. While other freshmen struggled with time management, I thrived on the structured schedule that reminded me of home. Business classes came naturally to me, probably because Walter had been teaching me practical applications since I was old enough to count change. What surprised me most was how easily my expenses were covered beyond the scholarship. Every semester, anonymous payments appeared in my student account for books, meal plans, and campus activities. When I called Walter to ask about it, he brushed off my concerns with typical modesty. "Don't worry about money, Milton. Focus on your studies. Some generous people believe in investing in deserving students. Just accept the blessing and work hard." Twice a year, Walter made the trip from Denver to visit me at Stanford. These visits became the highlights of my college experience, but something about them puzzled me. Walter always met privately with Dean Richardson, the head of the business school, before spending time with me. Their meetings lasted for hours, and when I asked about them, Walter claimed they discussed scholarship requirements and academic progress. During my sophomore year, I noticed Walter moving more slowly during his visits. He'd developed a persistent cough that he attributed to dust from construction sites. His face had grown thinner, and his hands trembled slightly when he thought I wasn't looking. When I suggested he see a doctor, he waved away my concerns with forced cheerfulness. "I'm just getting older, son. Nothing that rest and your mother hen worrying won't cure." By junior year, Walter's condition had worsened noticeably. His cough had deepened into harsh, rattling spasms that left him breathless. His clothing hung loosely on his shrinking frame and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Thomas Chen accompanied him on his spring visit driving while Walter dozed fitfully in the passenger seat. "Your father is stubborn," Thomas confided to me while Walter napped in my dorm room. "He's been sick for months but refuses to slow down or seek proper medical treatment. Maybe you can talk sense into him." That conversation marked the beginning of the most difficult period of my life. I convinced Walter to undergo a complete medical examination at Stanford's hospital, using my student health insurance to cover the costs. The diagnosis arrived like a punch to the stomach: stage 4 lung cancer, aggressive and advanced, with an estimated 6 months to live. Walter took the news with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout our years together. "Well," he said calmly, while the oncologist explained treatment options, "I suppose this gives us a timeline to work with." I wanted to drop out of Stanford immediately to care for him, but Walter refused to consider it. "Milton, you're 6 months away from graduating magna cum laude from one of the finest universities in America. I didn't work 3 jobs for 13 years, so you could throw away your education now." Instead, I arranged to take my final courses through independent study, allowing me to spend Walter's remaining months in Denver. We moved into a larger apartment that Thomas Chen helped us secure, one with better accessibility for Walter's weakening condition. During those precious final months, Walter began opening up about his past in ways he'd never done before. Late at night, when pain medication made him talkative, He shared fragments of a life I'd never imagined. "I wasn't always a janitor, Milton," he admitted one evening while I helped him with his medication. "Years ago, I owned a manufacturing company, made specialized parts for aircraft engines. The business was successful, profitable, growing every quarter." "What happened to it?" I asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. Walter's eyes grew distant and sad. "I got married to a woman named Patricia, who seemed to love me but really loved my money. When the company hit a rough patch during the recession, she filed for divorce and fought for half of everything I'd built. The legal battles lasted 3 years and cost me almost everything. By the time the dust settled, I'd lost the company most of my savings and my faith in relationships built on financial foundations." He turned to face me, his gaze clear despite the pain medication. "That's why I chose to live simply after that, Milton. I wanted to find out what really mattered in life. Money had corrupted my judgment and attracted people who didn't care about me as a person. I needed to discover who I was without the wealth and status." "So you became a janitor?" Walter smiled, the expression transforming his gaunt features. "I became a lot of things. I learned carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, construction. I tutored kids who couldn't afford expensive help. I volunteered at homeless shelters and community centers. For the first time in my adult life, I felt useful in ways that mattered." Thomas Chen visited almost daily during those final weeks, and gradually his relationship with Walter became clearer. They'd been business partners in the aircraft parts company, and Thomas had helped Walter navigate the divorce and business dissolution. More importantly, Thomas had been quietly managing what remained of Walter's assets for over a decade. "Your father is more complex than he's let you believe," Thomas told me during one of our conversations in the hospital cafeteria. His decision to live modestly wasn't just about finding meaning. He was also protecting himself and eventually protecting you from the kind of people who might take advantage of wealth. 3 days before Walter died, he handed me a small brass key and gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Milton, there's a metal box in my bedroom closet. Everything I couldn't tell you is in there. After the funeral, when you're ready, use that key. You'll understand why I kept so much hidden, and you'll have decisions to make about the future." His voice dropped to a whisper, but his eyes remained focused and alert. "Promise me something, son. Whatever you discover in that box, remember that every choice I made was to protect you and give you the best possible start in life. Use whatever you find to help others the way someone should have helped me when I was young and lost." Walter Brennan died peacefully on a Tuesday morning in May, with my hand holding his and Thomas Chen reading aloud from a book of poetry Walter had loved. His final words were, "I'm proud of the man you've become, Milton. Now go show the world what Walter Brennan's son can do." The funeral was standing room only, filled with people whose lives Walter had touched during his years of quiet service. Construction workers sat beside community center students. Elderly neighbors shared pews with homeless individuals Walter had fed at shelters. Ms. Patterson, my high school guidance counselor, traveled from Denver to pay her respects. "Your father was a remarkable man," she told me at the graveside service. "He helped more people than you'll ever know, always quietly, never seeking recognition or gratitude." 3 days after we buried Walter in a simple ceremony at Green Valley Cemetery, I stood alone in his bedroom, holding the brass key and staring at a metal box I'd never noticed before. My hands shook as I turned the key in the lock, having no idea that opening that box would change my life forever and set in motion events that would bring my biological parents crawling out of whatever hole they'd been hiding in for 27 years. Standing alone in Walter's empty apartment, surrounded by the lingering scent of his aftershave and the echoes of 13 years of laughter and lessons, I felt smaller than I had since that night in the airport when I was 5. The brass key seemed to weigh 10 pounds in my trembling fingers as I approached the metal box Walter had kept hidden in the back corner of his bedroom closet. The box itself was unremarkable gray steel about the size of a briefcase with a simple lock mechanism. I'd walked past it countless times while helping Walter organize his belongings during his illness, never thinking to question its contents. Now, 3 days after his funeral, it represented the final mystery of a man who had saved my life, but apparently kept enormous secrets. The key turned easily, and the lid opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent apartment. What I found inside made me stumble backward and sit heavily on Walter's bed, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality before me. Bank statements. Dozens of them from institutions I'd never heard Walter mention: Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Charles Schwab. Stock certificates for companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and Boeing. Property deeds for buildings in Denver, Phoenix, and San Francisco. Business partnership documents for ventures spanning 3 decades. But it was the handwritten letter on top addressed to my beloved son Milton that made my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the pages steady enough to read. "If you're reading this," Walter had written in his careful script, "then I'm gone and you're about to learn things about me that I never had the courage to tell you while I was alive. I hope you can forgive an old man's deception and understand why I chose to hide so much of my truth from you." The letter continued for 8 pages, detailing a story that shattered everything I thought I knew about the man who had raised me. Walter hadn't lost everything in his divorce. He'd hidden the majority of his wealth so thoroughly that even Patricia's aggressive legal team couldn't find it. Thomas Chen hadn't just been a friend and former business partner. He'd been the executor of a complex financial strategy that had protected and grown Walter's assets for over 2 decades. "I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I owned," Walter had written. "Too many people in my life had been drawn to my money rather than my character. With you, I had the chance to be valued for my heart, my time, my guidance, and my presence. You never asked me for expensive gifts or complained about our modest lifestyle. You appreciated every small gesture because you understood that love isn't measured in dollars." The numbers were staggering. Conservative stock investments had grown substantially over the years. The apartment building where we'd lived belonged to Walter, and he'd been subsidizing rent for struggling families throughout the entire structure. His anonymous donations to scholarship funds had actually been contributions from his own foundation, established years before he'd adopted me. Total estate value $6,500,000. The money comes with a responsibility, Milton. Walter's letter continued. "Half of this inheritance must be used to establish a foundation for abandoned children. I've already begun this work quietly, but I need you to expand it, formalize it, and ensure it continues long after we're both gone. Help children the way I helped you. Give them hope, education, and most importantly, love." I sat on Walter's bed for 3 hours, reading and rereading documents that revealed layer after layer of his secret generosity. He'd been funding scholarships for foster children throughout Colorado. He'd been paying medical bills for families who couldn't afford treatment. He'd been buying groceries for elderly neighbors and winter coats for homeless individuals. Thomas Chen arrived that evening, as if sensing I'd finally opened the box. He found me surrounded by papers, still wearing the same clothes from the morning, my face streaked with tears of grief, gratitude, and overwhelming confusion. "How long have you known?" I asked without looking up from the bank statements. "About the money since the beginning. About his decision to hide it from you, I disagreed with that choice. But I respected his reasoning. Walter was terrified that wealth would corrupt your relationship or attract people who didn't genuinely care about you." Thomas settled into Walter's reading chair, his expression gentle but serious. "There's something else you need to know, Milton. Walter spent considerable resources trying to locate your biological parents over the years. He wanted to ensure they couldn't interfere with the adoption or make legal claims against you later. His investigators discovered they'd moved, frequently changed names twice, and had multiple run-ins with law enforcement. Did he ever find them?" "Yes, about 5 years ago. They were living in Las Vegas, struggling financially, moving between cheap motels and borrowed couches. Walter's attorney sent them legal documents confirming that they had permanently relinquished all parental rights and could never contest the adoption. They signed the papers in exchange for a settlement of $10,000. I stared at Thomas in disbelief. They took money to confirm they didn't want me. I'm afraid so. Walter hoped that would be the end of it, but his lawyer advised him to prepare for the possibility that they might resurface if they ever discovered his wealth or your success. The next morning, Patricia Holbrook, Walter's estate attorney, arrived at the apartment with briefcases full of legal documents. She was a sharp woman in her 60s with silver hair and the efficient manner of someone who'd spent decades protecting her clients' interests. And Mr. Brennan, your father was extraordinarily thorough in his estate planning, she explained while spreading papers across Walter's kitchen table. The will is ironclad. The foundation paperwork is already filed, and all assets have been held in trust structures designed to minimize tax implications and legal challenges. Legal challenges, I repeated. Who would challenge Walter's will? Patricia's expression darkened. Unfortunately, inheritance disputes are more common than you might think. Distant relatives, former business associates, and yes, sometimes even biological parents who abandoned their children try to make claims on estates of this size. As if her words had summoned disaster from the universe itself, the apartment's doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a courier holding a certified letter from Hoffman and Associates Attorneys at Law. My signature was required, and the return address listed Las Vegas, Nevada. I signed for the envelope with growing dread, somehow knowing that my peaceful grief period was about to be shattered. Patricia and Thomas watched silently as I tore open the legal document that would drag Walter's memory through the mud and force me to fight for everything he'd tried to give me. The lawsuit was 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple, devastating claim: Daniel and Susan Parker, identifying themselves as my biological parents, were suing for the entire estate, plus punitive damages totaling $8.5 million. They claimed that adoption procedures in 1991 had been fraudulent, that they'd never truly consented to relinquish parental rights, and that Walter had unlawfully enriched himself by adopting their biological child under false pretenses. This is insane. I said, my voice rising with every word. They abandoned me. They left me alone in an airport for 8 hours. They took money 5 years ago to confirm they didn't want custody. Patricia studied the lawsuit with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. They're claiming that settlement was coerced and signed under duress. Their attorney is Richard Hoffman, unfortunately. He specializes in inheritance disputes and has a reputation for aggressive tactics and manufactured evidence. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his face grim. Walter anticipated this possibility. That's why he documented everything so carefully, why he kept records of their abandonment, why he made sure the adoption was legally bulletproof. Will that be enough? I asked, feeling the weight of Walter's legacy hanging in the balance. It should be, Patricia replied, but her tone wasn't as confident as I'd hoped. However, these cases often come down to which story the judge finds more compelling. They'll portray themselves as grieving parents who made a mistake and have spent 27 years regretting it. We'll need to present evidence of their true character and motives. That night, alone in the apartment that had been my sanctuary for 13 years, I called Sarah, my girlfriend from Stanford, who'd stood by me through Walter's illness and death. Her voice was warm and comforting across the miles between Denver and California. Milton, I'm so sorry. This sounds horrible and completely unfair. I don't understand how people can be so cruel, I said, staring at legal documents spread across Walter's handmade kitchen table. Walter gave me everything love education values: hope. These people gave me nothing but abandonment and trauma. Now they want to profit from his death. What are you going to do? I looked around the apartment, where Walter had raised me with such patient care, where he'd helped me with homework every night, where he'd celebrated my acceptance to Stanford with tears of pride in his eyes. The decision was easier than I'd expected. I'm going to fight them with everything I have. Walter deserves better than to have his legacy destroyed by greed. And I'm not going to let them steal resources that were meant to help abandoned children. What I didn't know as I made that promise in the darkness of Walter's empty apartment was that my biological parents' greed was even more calculated and vicious than I could have imagined, and that the upcoming legal battle would force me to confront truths about my abandonment that were far worse than a simple mistake or moment of panic. 2 weeks later, I sat in a sterile conference room at Hoffman and Associates, staring across a polished mahogany table at the two people who had given me life and then discarded me like unwanted luggage. 27 years had passed since that night at Denver International Airport, but I recognized them instantly, as if my 5-year-old trauma had burned their faces permanently into my memory. Daniel Parker had aged poorly. His once dark hair had receded to a gray horseshoe around a spotted scalp, and his face carried the puffy, unhealthy pallor of someone who'd spent decades avoiding responsibility. He wore an expensive navy suit that fit awkwardly on his soft frame, and his nervous fidgeting made the gold watch on his wrist catch the fluorescent lights repeatedly. Susan Parker had fought aging with the desperate arsenal of cosmetic surgery and chemical enhancement. Her face was stretched tight from multiple facelifts, her lips artificially plumped her forehead, frozen by Botox, into an expression of permanent mild surprise. Designer clothing and jewelry couldn't disguise the calculating coldness in her eyes, or the way she evaluated everything in the room as if assessing its monetary value. Their attorney, Richard Hoffman, was exactly what I'd expected from his reputation, a silver-haired predator in a $5,000 suit, with the smooth confidence of someone who'd made a career out of separating wealthy families from their inheritances. He greeted me with a politician's handshake and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Milton," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I'm sure this is difficult for you. Losing an adoptive parent, dealing with estate issues, and now discovering that your birth parents have been searching for you all these years. It must feel overwhelming." I glanced at Margaret Stone, the defense attorney Patricia Holbrook had recommended. Margaret was younger than Hoffman, but radiated competence and controlled aggression. She'd specialized in adoption law for 15 years and had never lost a case involving fraudulent inheritance claims. "My clients," Hoffman continued, gesturing toward the Parkers, "want you to understand that this lawsuit isn't about money. It's about correcting a historical injustice and restoring the family bonds that were severed by unfortunate circumstances." Susan Parker dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed no actual tears. "Milton, honey, not a day has gone by that we haven't thought about you. We were young, scared, dealing with financial pressures that made us temporarily incapable of proper judgment. Leaving you at that airport was the biggest mistake of our lives." Daniel Parker nodded vigorously, his jowls shaking with the effort. "We tried to find you, son. We contacted the police, hired private investigators, spent our life savings searching for any trace of where you'd gone. The adoption records were sealed so tightly we couldn't break through the bureaucracy." Margaret Stone opened her briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," she said with surgical precision, "I'm curious about this timeline you've described. According to airline records, you purchased one-way tickets from Phoenix to Denver on December 15th, 1991. One-way tickets for a family vacation seem unusual, don't you think?" Hoffman's smile faltered slightly. "Travel arrangements don't necessarily indicate intent. Many families book one-way flights for cost savings or schedule flexibility. Interesting theory, Margaret replied. However, banking records show that you liquidated your joint savings account, closed your checking account, and terminated your apartment lease all within the week before traveling to Denver. That suggests premeditation rather than a spontaneous family trip. I watched Susan Parker's expression harden as Margaret dismantled their fabricated narrative piece by piece. The tissue dabbing stopped, and her true nature began to show through the carefully constructed facade. Furthermore, Margaret continued, my investigator discovered that you filed a missing person report for Milton approximately 6 hours after abandoning him. However, you listed his status as deceased rather than missing and attempted to claim a life insurance policy on him just 3 months later. Daniel Parker's face flushed red. That was a paperwork error. We were grief-stricken and confused about the proper procedures. A paperwork error that would have netted you $50,000 in life insurance benefits. Margaret's voice remained level, but I could see the controlled fury in her posture. The same life insurance policy you'd purchased just 2 months before traveling to Denver? The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and Daniel Parker's increasingly labored breathing. Hoffman whispered something to his clients, then addressed Margaret with less confidence than before. These allegations are circumstantial and irrelevant to the current case. My client's parental rights supersede adoption procedures that were conducted without their proper consent. Actually, Margaret said, producing another document, they don't. 5 years ago, your client signed a legal waiver permanently relinquishing all parental rights in exchange for a financial settlement from Walter Brennan's estate. They took $10,000 to formally confirm they had no interest in pursuing custody or contact with Milton. This was the moment when Susan Parker's mask finally slipped completely. She slammed her hand on the conference table, her face contorting with rage that had nothing to do with maternal love or family bonds. That money was barely enough to cover our debts. If we'd known the old man was sitting on millions, we never would have signed those papers for such a pathetic amount. The silence that followed her outburst was deafening. Hoffman looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Daniel Parker stared at his wife in horror, finally understanding that she'd just destroyed their entire case with one moment of honest greed. Margaret Stone smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Mrs. Parker, thank you for that clarification. You've just admitted under oath that your motivation for this lawsuit is purely financial and has nothing to do with parental love or family reunification. The meeting ended 15 minutes later with Hoffman desperately trying to schedule a recess to and clarify certain statements his clients had made. As we gathered our documents, Susan Parker's veneer of civility evaporated entirely. You ungrateful little bastard, she hissed at me while Hoffman wasn't listening. We gave you life, and you're going to fight us over money that should rightfully belong to your real family. I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes and felt nothing but pity for the emptiness I saw there. You're not my family, I said quietly. You never were. Family doesn't abandon children in airports. Family doesn't try to profit from life insurance claims on missing 5-year-olds. And family certainly doesn't resurface 27 years later, demanding money from the man who actually raised me with love and sacrifice. Over the following weeks, Margaret's investigation uncovered a pattern of deception and fraud that stretched back decades. The Parkers had been married and divorced 4 times twice to each other, always during periods of financial crisis, when one spouse needed to protect assets from creditors. They'd attempted similar inheritance schemes with elderly relatives, including Susan's grandmother, who'd changed her will 3 times to exclude them from any benefits. Most damning was evidence that they'd hired Richard Hoffman 18 months before Walter's death after reading a newspaper article about successful Stanford graduates that mentioned my academic achievements and adoption story. They'd been planning this lawsuit since learning that Walter had raised a child who might eventually inherit significant wealth. The private investigator Margaret hired discovered that Susan Parker had a sealed juvenile record for child endangerment, stemming from an incident when she was 19, and left her infant nephew alone in a car for 4 hours while gambling at a casino. The record had been expunged, but enterprising investigators could still access certain details through cross-reference police reports. As we prepared for trial, I realized that this battle wasn't just about protecting Walter's inheritance or securing funding for the foundation. It was about defending the memory and legacy of the only father I'd ever known against people who viewed children as commodities and saw love as a weakness to be exploited. The night before opening statements, I visited Walter's grave at Green Valley Cemetery. Kneeling beside his simple granite headstone, I made him a promise that I intended to keep regardless of what happened in court. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really were. Not the secret millionaire, but the father who worked 3 jobs to give me opportunities. The man who stayed with a scared little boy in an airport when he could have just finished his shift and gone home. The person who taught me that integrity matters more than wealth, and that family is built through love, not biology. What I didn't know as I knelt there in the gathering dusk was that the courtroom drama about to unfold would reveal secrets about Walter's life and connections that would shock everyone involved, including me. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters and curious onlookers when I arrived for the first day of trial. Word had leaked about the unusual inheritance dispute, and local news stations were treating it like entertainment. Abandoned child battles birth parents for million-dollar fortune. Read the banner on Channel 7's morning broadcast. Inside Courtroom B, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. The Parkers sat at the plaintiff's table wearing expensive clothes that couldn't disguise their obvious discomfort under scrutiny. Richard Hoffman shuffled through papers with the confident air of someone who'd won similar cases, but I noticed his smile seemed forced when photographers captured him for the evening news. Margaret Stone had prepared me extensively for this moment, but nothing could have readied me for the emotional impact of listening to strangers debate the value and authenticity of Walter's love. As spectators filled the gallery behind us, I felt the weight of responsibility to honor everything Walter had taught me about dignity, truth, and standing up for what's right. The judge's bench remained empty as court personnel prepared for the proceedings. I kept glancing at the door behind the bench, wondering about the person who would ultimately decide whether Walter's final wishes would be honored or destroyed by the greed of 2 people who'd never shown me anything but cruelty. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the honorable judge presiding. The door opened, and my heart nearly stopped. Walking toward the bench in flowing black robes was Thomas Chen, Walter's longtime friend and monthly visitor, the man who'd helped me through Walter's illness and death. The man whose expensive suits and luxury cars had puzzled me, throughout my childhood, had been a federal judge all along. "Your Honor," Margaret Stone said, immediately rising from her seat, "I believe there may be a conflict of interest that requires addressing before we proceed." Judge Chen nodded gravely. "Counsel is correct. I have a personal relationship with the deceased and the defendant in this case. I'm recusing myself from these proceedings and requesting an immediate replacement." The courtroom buzzed with confusion and whispered conversations. Hoffman looked panicked, probably wondering if this development would somehow undermine his case. I sat in stunned silence, finally understanding why Thomas had always seemed so knowledgeable about legal matters and why his visits with Walter had been so formal and private. "The court will recess for 2 hours while we arrange for substitute judicial oversight," Judge Chen announced. Before leaving the bench, he caught my eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of support that gave me strength for whatever lay ahead. Judge Maria Santos took over the proceedings that afternoon. She was a stern woman in her 50s, with a reputation for fair but decisive rulings. Margaret had worked before her several times and described her as brilliant, thorough, and completely immune to manipulation. Hoffman's opening statement painted Daniel and Susan Parker as heartbroken parents who'd made a terrible mistake during a moment of personal crisis. According to his narrative, they'd spent 27 years searching for me, living with guilt and regret, only recently discovering my location through newspaper coverage of my academic achievements. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hoffman said with practiced emotion, "this case isn't about money. It's about correcting a historical injustice. These devoted parents were young, scared, and temporarily overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. They made a split-second decision that they've regretted every day since. Now finally reunited with their son, they're simply asking for recognition of their biological rights and fair compensation for the years they were denied the opportunity to raise the child they love." Margaret's opening statement was surgical in its precision. She systematically destroyed every element of Hoffman's fictional narrative with documented facts, airline records, banking statements, and police reports. But she saved her most powerful ammunition for last. The evidence will show, Margaret told the jury, that Daniel and Susan Parker didn't abandon Milton Brennan in a moment of panic or confusion. They planned his abandonment carefully, deliberately, and with calculated intent to commit insurance fraud. They purchased life insurance on their 5-year-old son, liquidated their assets, bought one-way airline tickets, and left him alone in an airport specifically hoping he would die or disappear so they could claim financial benefits. The gasps from the gallery were audible. Several jurors visibly recoiled at the implications of Margaret's statement. Susan Parker's face had gone pale beneath her heavy makeup, while Daniel Parker stared at his hands and refused to make eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "the evidence will demonstrate that their current lawsuit is merely the latest in a decades-long pattern of attempting to defraud family members, elderly relatives, and institutions for financial gain. They are not grieving parents seeking justice. They are predators who view children, including their own biological offspring, as potential sources of income." The next 3 days of testimony were emotionally devastating. Hoffman paraded a series of witnesses who claimed to remember the Parkers' desperate search for their missing son. Under Margaret's cross-examination, every single witness admitted to being paid for their testimony or revealed connections to previous Parker fraud schemes. Airport security frame footage from 1991, which had been preserved in evidence storage, showed Daniel and Susan Parker walking away from the baggage claim area. Without looking back, their body language relaxed and casual rather than panicked or distressed. The timestamp showed they'd left me alone at 3:15 in the afternoon, despite later claiming they'd only stepped away briefly. Janet Rodriguez, now retired from Child Protective Services, testified about finding me traumatized and abandoned, and about Walter's immediate and genuine concern for my welfare. Her voice broke as she described Walter's dedication to the adoption process and his obvious love for me throughout the proceedings. "In 30 years of social work," Janet said, "I never saw a more devoted father than Walter Brennan. That little boy was the center of his universe from the moment they met. Everything Walter did was focused on giving Milton the love, stability, and opportunities he deserved." The most damaging testimony came from Richard Hoffman's own investigator, a man named Frank Morrison, who'd been hired to research Walter's background and assets. Under subpoena, Morrison revealed that the Parkers had contacted Hoffman's firm 18 months before Walter's death, immediately after reading about my academic success in a Stanford alumni magazine. "Mrs. Parker called our office specifically asking about inheritance law and parental rights," Morrison testified reluctantly. She wanted to know whether biological parents could challenge adoption proceedings if the adoptive family came into significant wealth. Margaret's final witness was Thomas Chen, now speaking as a character witness rather than a judge. His testimony revealed Walter's secret generosity and the foundation work he'd been conducting for years to help abandoned children find loving homes. Walter Brennan was the most principled man I've ever known. Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the federal bench. He chose to live modestly, not because he lacked resources, but because he understood that character isn't built through material comfort. He raised Milton with the values that money can't buy: integrity, compassion, hard work, and genuine love for others. The turning point came during Susan Parker's cross-examination. Margaret had spent hours methodically dismantling her fabricated timeline and exposing contradictions in her testimony. Finally frustrated by the relentless questioning, Susan Parker revealed her true nature in spectacular fashion. "You want to know the truth?" she screamed, jumping to her feet despite Hoffman's desperate attempts to silence her. "That kid was nothing but a burden from the day he was born. We were drowning in debt, couldn't afford groceries, and Walter was a fool for taking on someone else's problems. If he wanted to waste his money playing daddy to a throwaway kid, fine, but that inheritance should come to us. We're his real family, not some janitor who got lucky." The courtroom erupted in shocked voices and gasps. Judge Santos banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, while Hoffman looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Several jury members stared at Susan Parker in open disgust, and I saw one woman wiping tears from her eyes. Margaret Stone stood slowly, her expression calm despite the magnitude of what had just happened. "Your Honor, I believe Mrs. Parker has just provided the most honest testimony this court has heard. No further questions." That evening, outside the courthouse, Susan Parker made one final attempt to destroy Walter's memory and my peace of mind. As reporters surrounded us with cameras and microphones, she pointed directly at me and delivered a statement that revealed the depth of her cruelty. "That ungrateful brat doesn't deserve a penny of what Walter left him. We gave him life, and this is how he repays us. Fighting his own parents over money that belongs to his real family? Walter was obviously senile when he made that will, probably manipulated by lawyers and social workers who wanted to keep their meal ticket happy." Her words stung, but they also crystallized something important for me. Standing there on the courthouse steps, surrounded by strangers trying to profit from Walter's death and my pain, I realized that the trial had never really been about money. It was about protecting the legacy of love and sacrifice that Walter had built, with 13 years of quiet devotion. That night, I called Sarah from my hotel room, emotionally drained but oddly optimistic about the future. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm with concern across the distance. "Better than I expected," I admitted. Listening to them lie about Walter and twist our story into something ugly was horrible, but it also made me understand something important. They can't take away what Walter gave me. They can't steal 13 years of bedtime stories, homework, help, life lessons, and unconditional love. Even if they somehow win this case, they'll never have what Walter and I had together. What I didn't know as I fell asleep that night was that Judge Santos had already made her decision, and that the final day of trial would bring revelations that would close this chapter of my life forever, while opening new possibilities I'd never imagined. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for Judge Santos's final ruling. Word had spread throughout Denver's legal community about the dramatic testimony and Susan Parker's explosive outburst. Local newspapers had picked up the story, and I noticed several people in the gallery wearing small yellow ribbons that someone had distributed as symbols of support for abandoned children. Margaret Stone had warned me that inheritance disputes could go either way regardless of moral considerations or evidence of character. "Judges focus on legal technicalities and precedent," she'd explained. "We've presented a strong case, but family law can be unpredictable, especially when biological parents claim their rights were violated." As Judge Santos reviewed her notes one final time, I thought about Walter and how proud he'd be of my decision to fight for his legacy, rather than simply settling out of court. The Parkers had offered to drop their lawsuit in exchange for $2 million, but accepting their extortion would have betrayed everything Walter had taught me about standing up for what's right. Before I render my decision, Judge Santos announced, I want to address the fundamental question at the heart of this case. This lawsuit claims to be about parental rights and family bonds, but the evidence has revealed motivations that are purely financial and completely lacking in genuine parental love or concern. She turned to face the Parkers directly, her expression stern with judicial authority. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, your testimony has demonstrated a pattern of calculated deception spanning multiple decades. You abandoned your 5-year-old son in a public place with the intent of collecting insurance benefits if harm came to him. You declared him legally dead to facilitate fraudulent claims. You signed legal documents 5 years ago, permanently relinquishing parental rights in exchange for financial compensation. And you initiated this lawsuit only after learning that Milton had potentially inherited significant wealth. Daniel Parker slumped in his chair as if physically deflated by the judge's words. Susan Parker maintained her defiant posture, but I could see panic creeping into her eyes as she realized their scheme was collapsing completely. Furthermore, Judge Santos continued, the evidence shows that Walter Brennan provided Milton with love, education, stability, and moral guidance for 13 years. Mr. Brennan's character has been attested to by educators, social workers, community members, and federal judges. His devotion to Milton's welfare was absolute and selfless. The judge paused, allowing her words to resonate throughout the silent courtroom. When she spoke again, her voice carried the full weight of legal and moral authority. I find no merit whatsoever in the plaintiff's claims. The adoption of Milton Brennan was conducted properly and legally. Walter Brennan's will is valid and enforceable. The plaintiff's parental rights were permanently and irrevocably terminated through their own actions and legal agreements. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I had to grip the edge of our table to keep from falling. Margaret Stone squeezed my shoulder, her professional composure cracking slightly to reveal a satisfied smile. Moreover, Judge Santos said, her voice growing stern, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The evidence of insurance fraud, perjury, and attempted extortion warrants prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. Hoffman was frantically whispering to his clients, probably advising them about Fifth Amendment rights and criminal defense strategies. The confident smirk Susan Parker had worn throughout most of the trial had been replaced by genuine fear as she realized that their greed had led them into legal jeopardy, far beyond a failed civil lawsuit. The court awards all attorney fees and costs to the defendant, Judge Santos concluded. This case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled under any circumstances. Mr. Brennan, you have my condolences on the loss of your father and my admiration for your dignity throughout these difficult proceedings. As the gavel fell for the final time, the courtroom erupted in applause from spectators who'd followed the case. Several people approached me with congratulations and words of support for the foundation Walter had envisioned. Janet Rodriguez, who'd attended every day of the trial, hugged me tightly and whispered, Walter would be so proud of you, honey. Outside the courthouse, the Parkers' final confrontation revealed the complete absence of any parental feeling they might have possessed. Susan Parker pointed an accusatory finger at me while reporters recorded her words. This isn't over. She screamed, her carefully maintained appearance disheveled by stress and fury. We'll appeal this decision, and we'll keep fighting until we get what's rightfully ours. Mrs. Parker, I said calmly, speaking directly into the news cameras, you had your chance to be my parents 27 years ago. You chose money over me then, and you're choosing money over me now. Walter Brennan showed me what real love looks like, and it has nothing to do with courtrooms or inheritance claims. Daniel Parker surprised everyone, including his wife, by stepping forward and addressing me directly. His voice was quiet and ashamed, barely audible over the crowd noise and camera clicks. Milton, I want you to know that leaving you in that airport wasn't my idea. I was weak scared, and I let her convince me that we had no other choice. I've regretted it every day since, and I'm sorry for what we put you through with this lawsuit. You deserved better from us, and you deserved better than having your grief disturbed by our greed. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to genuine remorse I'd heard from either of them. Susan Parker stared at her husband in shock and rage, probably realizing that his admission could complicate their criminal defense strategy. 3 months later, both Parkers were convicted of fraud and perjury charges. Susan received 18 months in federal prison, while Daniel was sentenced to 6 months and community service. Richard Hoffman was disbarred for coaching false testimony and suborning perjury. The Walter Brennan Foundation officially opened 6 months after the trial concluded, using $3.25 million from the inheritance. We established scholarship programs for foster children, emergency assistance funds for adoptive families, and advocacy services for abandoned children throughout Colorado and eventually nationwide. The foundation's headquarters occupied the ground floor of a renovated building in downtown Denver, with bright, cheerful spaces designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. The walls displayed photographs of children who'd been helped by our programs, along with quotes from Walter about the importance of love education and second chances. I kept the remaining $3.25 million from Walter's inheritance, using it to expand the foundation's work and establish satellite offices in Phoenix, San Francisco, and eventually 12 other cities. Every dollar was spent with Walter's values in mind, helping children find loving families, supporting educational opportunities, and proving that family isn't about biology, but about commitment, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Sarah moved to Denver after finishing her graduate program at Stanford, and we were married in a small ceremony at Green Valley Cemetery, with Walter's headstone serving as a silent witness to our vows. We adopted 2 siblings, Emily and James, who'd been abandoned at a bus station in Kansas City. Watching them learn to trust again, seeing them thrive in an environment of stability and love, gave me daily reminders of Walter's greatest gift, the knowledge that broken children can heal when they're given genuine care and unwavering support. The foundation has helped over 800 children find permanent homes in the 5 years since its establishment. We've provided scholarships to 230 foster children pursuing higher education. Our emergency assistance program has prevented 43 adoptions from failing due to financial hardships. Every morning, I arrive at the foundation office and spend a few minutes looking at Walter's photograph on my desk. It shows him at my Stanford graduation, his face radiant with pride as we pose together in front of the university's main gate. His hand rests on my shoulder with gentle protectiveness, and his smile captures the pure joy of a father celebrating his son's achievements. The legal battle with my biological parents taught me something crucial about the difference between relatives and family. Blood relationships mean nothing without love, commitment, and sacrifice. Walter chose to be my father every single day for 13 years, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He worked 3 jobs to give me opportunities, stayed up late helping with homework, celebrated every small victory, and provided comfort during every disappointment. The greatest inheritance Walter left me wasn't money or property or investment portfolios. It was the understanding that love is a choice, not an obligation. Family is built through daily acts of kindness, patience, and putting someone else's needs above your own interests. Walter showed me that true wealth comes from lifting others up, not accumulating possessions for personal benefit. Last month, I received a letter from Daniel Parker written from the halfway house where he was completing his sentence. He apologized again for the pain he'd caused and asked if there was any way he could contribute to the foundation's work, perhaps by sharing his story with at-risk parents who might be considering abandoning their children. I wrote back offering him the chance to speak at our annual fundraising dinner about the consequences of his choices and the importance of getting help during family crises, rather than making destructive decisions. It won't repair the damage he caused, but it might prevent other children from experiencing what I went through at that airport baggage claim 27 years ago. Standing in the foundation office at the end of each day, watching staff members coordinate adoptions and scholarship awards, I often whisper the same words I spoke at Walter's graveside. Thank you, Dad. He saved my life that night in Denver International Airport, but more importantly, he taught me how to save others. The children we help will never know Walter personally, but they'll benefit from the values he instilled in me, that every child deserves love. That family is built through actions rather than genetics, and that the greatest wealth comes from using whatever resources you have to create hope for others who are still lost and waiting for someone to find them. Walter Brennan's legacy lives on in every life touched by love over greed, in every child who finds a permanent home, and in every person who chooses compassion over selfishness. That's the real inheritance he left me, and it's worth more than all the money in the world. I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced betrayal from people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? How did you overcome that pain and build healthier relationships? Share your stories in the comments below, because your experiences might help someone else who's struggling with similar challenges. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, subscribe to see more content about resilience and family bonds, and share this with someone who needs to remember that family is about love, not biology. Thank you for taking this journey with me today, and I hope Walter's story reminds you that the greatest gifts we can give each other are time, attention, and unconditional support. Take care, and remember that you deserve to be loved for exactly who you are.